One of the world's biggest and most politically relevant conflicts has come to a head again in 2021. This has been making the news worldwide. So, on today's episode of Arnie News, we'll be discussing the Israel Palestine conflict, its history and its present, and the ethics surrounding it. So, this was originally supposed to be the first episode of this new season, but as I was writing the script, I found it harder and harder to be unbiased. And the fundamental of this channel is to be 100% facts, 0% bias. But I've tried my best to be, unbiased and give my analysis of the facts, and I hope that you can come to a good conclusion based on what I've said. But this was one of the hardest episodes for me to write, which is why it was delayed, and I made the NFTs episode last week. So let's go back to the beginning, and the beginning of this conflict is in the late 19th century. Yeah, this is not a 1,000-year-old conflict or that's been happening for thousands of years between Islam and, it's not a religious conflict either in its core. And I think that those are two huge misconceptions, and I'll get to them. But let's just go to the beginning again. So, the Ottoman Empire was in control of what we now call both Israel and Palestine. That entire area was under control of the Ottoman Empire, and that area was called Ottoman Palestine. It had 85% Muslim Arabs, and the rest were also Arabs, but they were of different religions, mainly Judaism and Christianity. And they were all coexisting peacefully, and there was no conflict. Meanwhile, in Europe, there was a movement called the Zionist movement. And this was a movement made by Jews that felt that they want their own nation. They wanted to move out of, Europe and come back to Jerusalem, which is their holy land. But right now, Jerusalem was a part of the Ottoman Palestine. So this is where the conflict begins. And then World War One happens, and the Ottoman Empire falls. And as a result of this, the British take control of that Palestinian region, and now it's called British Palestine. And they don't really want to keep it for too long, so they brokered three agreements. One is with the Zionists, and they agree that the Zionists will be allowed to move into this area, and a part of it will be given to them to make their own Jewish state. The second part of the agreement is with the Arabs, and they make an agreement with the Saudi Arabians that this will be a part of Arabia and the Saudi Arabia, and they'll have one unified state with Palestine as a part of it. And thirdly, they make a secret deal with the French behind the backs of both these candidates that they'll give to them. So they've made three deals essentially, and all of them are for the same land. So what happens is slowly Jews try to start moving in to Palestine, and eventually they make a considerable population, and the British are opposed to this. But what happens is World War II. And what's famous about World War II, or at least relevant to this topic, is the Holocaust, which was an atrocity against Jews committed by the Nazi Germany, which led to almost millions of them being killed. So, as a result of this, they all started fleeing to Palestine, to Jerusalem, where their home is, or their ancestral, or their original home is. But they hadn't actually been occupying that area for a long time, and there was international support to give them their own country. So the British had to succumb, and the Jewish people started entering this area in droves. And in 1948, they called for independence. And now there was independence given to the entire land of British Palestine. And there's this really jigsaw puzzle like map drawn to divide the land between Israel and Palestine. And the surprising thing is that Jerusalem is given to Palestine. And this definitely comes into play later. But the rest of the Arab world isn't too happy about this. They've all also recently gained independence, and countries like Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Kuwait, they're all not really satisfied with the solution that the British came to, because they find that these Jewish people have come from nowhere, or come from Europe, and now they're claiming half of that land which was originally belonging to the Palestinians. So they start a war with Israel, and it doesn't go too well for Israel, and they lose. The Gaza Strip is taken control by Egypt, which is on this side, and on this side, this huge area of land which is under Palestine is taken control by Jordan, and these are Arab countries. So the Arabs basically occupy this area, and this puts pressure on Israel. There's tension building up between Israel and the Arab nations, and in 1967 we get this huge event called the Six-Day War, and here Israel successfully fights off all these Arab countries, and they take back control, or they don't take it back, they take control of Gaza, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank. So they take it from Egypt and Jordan, and they take control of this area now. And this is Palestinian area full of Arabs. And what they do is they start sending in their people to settle into these people's homes, and this is actually called Jerusalem Day, and this is widely celebrated among the Jewish right-wing community in Israel, and this is supposed to be a great day in their history, but what it is that it was a day where Israel won a war and let their people move into another place which did not belong to them. So what happens next is that there's almost 40 years without any solutions. There's just violence from both sides, and there's nothing productive that happens. And then in the early 2000s under Clinton, the US signs this agreement between the two countries, and that states that they will follow this two-state solution, and there will be a resolution to the conflict. And internationally this was seen as something that was really good, and finally maybe this conflict will end. But we now know that it didn't. So basically what Israel did is they built walls to demarcate the boundary, but what they did was they left little bit of the Jewish occupied area in each of these places inside the Palestinian boundary, which allowed the Jewish population to occupy that region. So what they did was, instead of drawing fair boundaries, they left a little bit of the Jewish people into each boundary that they drew, and they said that these were the original inhabitants of this area, so how can we move them to Israel? But that isn't really a valid argument, and this angered the Palestinian people. So the Palestinians realized that even if they try to do these peaceful negotiations with the Israelis, that they won't respect their the agreement, and they decide to resort to violence. And we have these two huge revolutions called the Intifadas, Intifada 1 and Intifada 2, and they're led by this militia group called Hamas, which was created to fight back against the Israelis, who have like huge military power thanks to their support from the US and the UK. And what these violent revolutions end up doing is making the Israelis oppress the Palestinians even more, and push back with much more military force than with which Hamas attacked them. So that's the situation that we were in until today. And that brings us to 2021, where during Ramadan, which is the holiest month for the Muslims, which make the majority of the Palestinian population, the Israeli military kept coming into Jerusalem and troubling the residents and disrupting their prayers. And the worst situation was when they went into a mosque during the prayers and started beating up and injuring almost 600 Palestinian residents. So in response to this, Hamas released missiles and rockets at Israel. And these rockets obviously were not able to affect Israel much, and 2 people were killed, but 90% of these missiles have been stopped by Israel's solid defense mechanism called the Iron Dome. And then they decide to start retaliating, and they send their rockets, which are much more powerful, into Gaza, and they destroy these huge civilian buildings full of women and children, and we see 28 people killed, of which 12 are women and children, innocent civilians. And especially the buildings that they hit were of media outlets like the Associated Press and Al Jazeera, which are not, Palestinian media outlets. These are international media outlets. And journalists from the Associated Press and Al Jazeera were made to flee for their lives due to Israeli missiles. And the death and destruction caused by Israel with the amount of might they have is what makes this such a huge issue, and why suddenly you see a lot of support towards Palestine. So, what the issue boils down to now is that one side is so overpowered and the other side is so underpowered. And the overpowered side, instead of using that position of power to diffuse the situation, they always retaliate tenfold. And on top of this, they have the support of countries like the US and UK because of historical partnerships. But the problem is that they are essentially in violation of international law. According to the UN's law and the international law, they are illegally occupying that area, and that should be recognized for what it is on a global scale. But it sadly isn't. Most countries are still pro-Israel, or at least the powerful ones are still pro-Israel, and that gives Israel the liberty to keep attacking the Palestinians and use these small counter-attacks, or like the counters that Hamas do at Israel, which 90% of which they can defend from, so it doesn't really affect them, to keep attacking the civilians and the normal people of Palestine. And people will use Hamas as an excuse, saying that they're the ones that they're attacking Israel too, but in the end, the death counts and the casualties that you can see from both sides will show you that one side is clearly attacking the other one way more and with way more force. And they, on a global level, this is why it's getting so much attention, because one side is overpowered and they're abusing that power to oppress the smaller community. But our social media cycle has already moved on from this. And that's another reason why I wanted to make this a little bit later, to show that just because everyone has stopped posting about it on their stories, the situation hasn't ended, and it's a very real conflict that's still going on. The bombings and the fighting may stop for now, but the oppression of the Palestinians won't. And if the countries like US and UK keep supporting Israel without condemning their actions against the Palestinians in the name of terrorism, then I don't think that we can see a solution to this anytime soon. The world stage needs to recognize that Palestinians have equal right to that area as the Israelis do. And the Israeli right to that area is also being called into question. And again, that is a biased and that is a opinion based thing which I will not comment on. But what I will say is this. How would you feel if somebody came to your house saying that their great great grandfather lived there, entered by force, and started living in one of your rooms? Then they slowly start staking claim to the different rooms, your kitchen, your bedroom, and then they try to kick you out of your own house, saying that this is their house because their great grandfather lived there many years ago. And they try to kick you out of your own house, and now you're left homeless, and everyone else in the community agrees, yeah, this is their house. How would you feel? That is the situation that the Palestinians are in. This is not an opinion, this is the situation that has happened. And that is the truth of the situation that most people will not acknowledge. So, what can we learn from this? What I learned is that colonialism still exists to this day, and something that we thought was eradicated, essentially that's what Israel is trying to do, right? They have taken over this land that is not theirs, and they're trying to remove the people that were originally there and try to force their culture and their people onto this land. That's essentially what the British did around the world, and what the British did in America, and that is essentially what the Israelis are doing now. So that is just colonialism in a new disguise. And that's what I learned from this, that we still have colonialism. It's not gone as we thought with the end of World War II. And that is something really scary. Thank you for watching Arnie News.